on 26 June of 1995, following the Brioni meeting on the 31st of July. Our brief discusses this in paragraph 189 to 235. The position of the prosecution demonstrates a serious misapprehension of the chain of command at strategic, operational, and a tactical level. The prosecution's argument is based on the fact that there are additional targets and names of towns in General Gotovine's attack order. Well, of course there would be. When the main staff issues an order, they do so at a strategic level. When it goes down to the operational level, at the General Gotovine level, additional targeting takes place. That targeting focuses on the strategic targets, as outlined by the HV staff, and then the operational targets, as developed by military district commander and his subordinates in the field. As they move down, of course, there are additional targets as we move through these three levels. The targets discussed by Mr. Reichich during his testimony, be they in Canine or any other towns discussed, were at the operational level. In addition, as I mentioned, to the strategic operational targets, the subordinate HV units, in responding to matters during the course of the trial, had tactical targets that they were able to engage as the circumstances developed during battle. A simple proposition, as the embattled folds, that targets develop over time. The Gotovine defense previously presented this issue to the Chamber through D 1459 and D 1460. We took the Yagata chart, for instance, and overlay it on Bankovats to show the targeting of not only the operational targets, but any number of tactical targets in and around Bankovats. And in the interest of time, I just offered at the trial chamber those sites to explain how the development will transpire from the strategic to the operational to the tactical level. None of the slides shown to you by Mr. Russo relating to the shelling in Canine, Bankovats, Obervats, and Grouchots account for tactical targets at all. In addition to the misunderstanding of military doctrine, the prosecution misunderstands the significance of documents in the effort to support their argument. For instance, Mr. Russo relied on P2338, which is a coded infantry map, to support argument in paragraphs 594 to 605 of its brief that MRLs were directed against civilian areas. They overlooked the explanation by Mr. Reichich, who directly refuted this position at page 16,554, line 11 through 18, where he explained, I have additional sites in that, it's 16,554, lines 8 to 16,556, line 9. He explained that P338 was a coded infantry map used for communications and general reference points. He always said and testified that to know the precise target, you would need the XYZ coordinates which the HV had for every target fired on, as Reichich confirmed in D 1425, paragraph 29, and his testimony at 17,641, lines 17 through 22. As you saw in the visual aid presented by Mr. Russo, and if we can turn this, S15 and S54 coordinate with optional targets identified by Mr. Reichich. They're also, as Mr. Reichich would explain, are general reference points. Further, S16, the one of direct interest to the prosecution, is oriented in line with the Northern Barracks, another operational target identified by Mr. Reichich and hit by the HV. paragraph 601 of its brief, prosecution attempts to corroborate their interpretation of P2338 by asserting that Mr. Hill found a rocket at General Ferrand's residence, which he located being inside S-16. This can be viewed by the next slide presented by Mr. Russo. This is an overlay of S-16 with the identification by Hill of Ferrand's residence.
Mr. Kegel,
Yes.
could I just see, please explain what you exactly meant by is oriented in line with? That is a phrase which was not entirely clear to me. Yes.
If we see the S-16, and I will explain this further, is on a line of fire going into the northern barracks.
Could it be turned in such a way that we have knee on top the word knee to rotate?
If we can, I think it's
Yes.
yes, I think that was right. Yes. If we see over in the lower left-hand corner there, Judge, that's the northern barracks.
Yes.
And it's oriented on fire there. To explain that further, Mr. Boucher lived in the S-16 area. And Mr. Boucher testified that there was, in fact, artillery. Nothing about MRLs. Artillery coming into that direction, into the area he lived, which he assumed was artillery fire on the northern barracks.
And then stemming from there, but if I need a line related to a certain point, it could be in all directions, isn't it?
It could be. But I just offer you, Mr. President, the testimony of the witnesses that we have. Mr. Boucher saying that he lived in S-16, that he had artillery fire, and that he assumed that fire going in towards the Senyak barracks, mentioning nothing about multi-barrel rocket launchers.
Thank you. Please proceed. Sorry to interrupt you.
No problem, Mr. President. If we can go back to the other chart, in an attempt to support their position, they note that Mr. Hill allegedly found a rocket in this area, in the area which he identified where General Ferrand lived. Now, the first thing we know about this is the rocket identified by Mr. Hill at 3,755, lines 8 to 9, didn't match the specifications of any HV rocket in use during Operation Storm. Second, what the prosecution doesn't show you is that Mr. Hill was incorrect about the location of General Ferrand's residence. Now, Mr. Hill testified before General Ferrand. This map was never shown to General Ferrand to accurately assess did he in fact live at that location. The subject, however, did come up with Mr. Dawes on page 5 and 6 of his witness statement, P980. Mr. Dawes testified that in his second trip into Canine, he went into a residential neighborhood by Ferrand's residence. You will see from the next slide, which is P586, that, D856, my apologies, from D856, that the area identified by Mr. Dawes as the location of General Ferrand's residence is different than the one offered by Mr. Hill. Further, as I noted, prosecution witness Boucher did live in the area of S-16, which can be seen in Exhibit P1179, and although Mr. Boucher testified to artillery fire coming into that area in the direction towards the northern barracks, as I noted, he mentioned nothing about the MRLs. Finally, the defense notes that P2338 contains dozens and dozens of circles. Why? Because this is a map as used for communications and general reference points of infantry. If the prosecution's position is correct, we submit to you that these circles and artillery fire into all of these circles would have been mentioned in any number of other diaries at operation and certainly at a tactical level. They were not. Mr. President, I note it's 10:30. I'm about to go into another aspect of this, but it is going to take a couple of minutes.
I leave it to you whether you want to take those minutes, a couple of minutes now, or whether you'd prefer to have a break first and then to resume at 5 minutes to 11.
I think it's probably best to go through 5 minutes to 11. I just looked at it. It's a little bit more than a couple of minutes. I don't want to be misleading, but I don't want to overstate either.
We'll have a break and we'll resume at 5 minutes to 11 sharp.
All right.